Tim Butcher returns to the podcast to follow up with another incredible journey through an African nation. The first time Tim appeared here, he spoke about his adventures through the Congo, weaving a story of an incredibly rich and incredibly beautiful, but as well an incredibly desperate country that is undeveloping. It remains easily one of my favorite episodes I've ever had the privilege to record. Tim, this time around, takes us through his month-long journey through Liberia and Sierra Leone. He wrote a book about it called Chasing the Devil, and as the title alludes, a big part of the journey was trying to come to terms with the voodoo, black magic, and devil worship that he encounters along the way. Much like his Congo trip, Tim is again journeying in the footsteps of a great writer who had come and gone before him. In the case of Liberia, it is the famous author and journalist Greene. So in addition to Greene, in this podcast, you can expect to hear Tim wax lyrical, what makes good writing and what makes good communication, a full top to bottom on Charles Taylor, this horrific and brutal dictator of Liberia. Tim then gives a bit of history as well on Liberia and talks about the journey and some of the incredible characters he met along the way. Plus, in and amongst all of this, we actually take a bit of a break. We are interrupted by cricket chat. Since we recorded this podcast during the first day of the fourth test. And it turns out both of us are rather cricket tragic. So it actually came at a pretty unopportune time. I have edited this part out and left it at the end, since I'm sure that the majority of you will not be interested in that. But otherwise, as usual, you'll be able to navigate with the timestamps. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in here, in my opinion. And Tim, again, is reaffirmed as one of the natural-born podcasters. He almost speaks in finished prose. It's amazing. And so, with no further ado, pump that good juice into the algorithm. Swipe up and pump 5 stars into Spotify and into Apple. Let's take the reviews past 200, and here is the great and powerful Tim Butcher. Mr. Butcher, welcome back.
Nice to be back.
I wanted to open up with a bit of audio from a fellow Tim Marshall, a comrade of yours. This is something he said about you.
Tim, I was going to say is such a good writer. I remember especially his stuff from the Balkans. And I think from memory, because we covered pretty much the same stuff for so long, whether, Iraq or and the Balkans especially. So I think it was probably Kosovo, and I think it was a Serbian tank. And I have fond memories of Tim. It's funny, we were never friends. We were friendly colleagues, but I was an admirer of his writing. Here's a little vignette, and I'll open my heart. I'd come back from, I think, Bosnia once, and I was decompressing in a cafe, and I read a story of his, and he had this one line in it. I still remember it. I mean, this is 30 years, and a young little girl that had her arm blown off, and his quote was, and she said to her mum, "Mummy, where's my arm?" And I just went in floods of tears in the cafe. There was something about the construction of the sentence, and of course the awfulness of it. But no, Tim, top journalist.
Okay, so I just wanted to share that with you because I wanted to ask you what you think about good writing.
Bit of a sucker punch, actually. Forgive me when I cover my eyes. I can remember that all too well. Joseph Conrad had a beautiful phrase, and one that I, like all journalists, steal and borrow. He said, good writing is like the finest music. You hear it at the time, you enjoy it at the time, it fills your senses, but what makes it special is it comes to you afterwards. You echo the rhythm, the cadence, the harmony. It comes back to you. You can pick it up in other times, in other contexts, in other pieces of music, in replaying that piece of music. And for me, the test of good writing is, do you remember it? And to be honest, the detail of that story is moving from Tim Marshall at Vignette. And thank you for that, and thanks to Tim for his candor and his empathy. But the thing I take from that, mostly, is that he's referring to something he read 30 years ago. So if it stuck with him, then I'm a very proud writer, because that means that piece of music is still in his head.
That's a lovely Joseph Conrad quote. What about good speaking? Because something that has stood out to me in the audience since your last appearance was just how the distance between what you might have written down and then how you speak is very narrow. It's almost kind of like completed sentences. So an amazing speaker as well as good writer. So how do you think about speaking relating to the writing?
What's going on today? We've got the double sucker punch. We're going soft with Tim, and now you're going on the flattery with this one. Well, I'm going to be jelly. The knees are going already. You've got me. I'm going to go like a little pussycat. What do you want me to do next? Well, I mean, it's easy peasy. I don't know. There was an old Roman orator who said there are three things about speaking. One is to educate, one is to enlighten, and one is to inspire. And I think about that because, if you can leave someone, any speaker, and I mean a politician, a journalist, in any form, they have this terrible. The biggest sin is to project that you know it all. This lack of humility, and I think of politicians in particular. They promise everything. I think of Boris Johnson. He delivers a beautiful speech, but he conveys this image of knowing all. I'm a know-it-all. And there's one lesson my mother taught me, which is that don't be a know-it-all. And it's a thing that runs through all my writing and my speaking and my engagement, which is that admitting what you don't know is the bravest possible thing. So, for example, those exploratory books I've done were exercises in not knowing and being intimidated and wanting to go back and then presenting to a reader a version, but at no stage saying, "Whoa, I'm the world expert on. There's nothing more to know. I know it all," because that's not the point. And that's why that oratory element, I think, is to inspire. I want, in as much as I have a goal, for someone to listen to this, for it to be a brain worm away in their head, go back and go, "Oh yeah, that guy said that. Maybe I'll read this, or maybe I'll listen to that, or maybe I'll reconsider these values and thoughts that I've had, or maybe what he said about nations, does that apply to us?" And that is a really powerful and special feature. And it's an honor, a luxury for a speaker to be able to have that opportunity. And let's be reminded, since we spoke 2 years ago, the podcast space, how crowded has it become? I mean, you know very well. You know about algorithms, you know about positions, you know about Spotify rankings. Wow, how crowded has it become? So it is extraordinary that anyone would want to listen to me in that crowded space. And that is why I regard it as an honor to be given consideration. And my driving thought, framing, the framing way I go about this is hoping I've got something interesting to say, never pretending I know it all.
Who do you think of when I ask you about good speakers?
I think of an English teacher of mine, actually, who had a wonderful way about him, and he was particularly good at poetry, teaching poetry, because he would ask us to read, and then he had this wonderful way, because he would then make a comment. Exactly. And then leave it to you to respond. What is your emotional response? Is it a laugh, a chuckle? Is it a gasp? Is it a imponderable? Is it a looking inside yourself? Good speakers, brevity and clarity. You say so much more by saying less. Tim Marshall's a broadcast journalist. He said in that little vignette at the beginning, we weren't close friends. True enough, and I'll tell you why. We're two tribes. He was a broadcast journalist. His job was to say it in 90 words or 90 seconds. My job is to write 800 words, 1,000 words, 1,400 words. It's a lot. It's a very different thing. So broadcast journalists have a natural control because they say it so much clearer. And if I can give you one little vignette. So he mentioned Bosnia, I think, or the Balkans. He mentioned Kosovo and a tank. Did you play him that because I'd said that Tim Marshall, I once saw him on a tank running it? Yeah. Well, he's actually the detail was, it wasn't Kosovo, it was Bosnia, it was Mount Igman, it was July 1995, and it was a white French tank. I've got a picture of the white French tanks, the French Foreign Legion ones, and he was sitting on it doing his piece to camera. Doesn't matter. Anyway, so a journalist needed to do a piece about Bosnia. Bosnia is complicated. You have different ethnicities, you've got different political forces, you've got different international players. The joke was that by the time you got to the end of that sentence, everyone switched off, right? It's really difficult to convey complexity. So how do you do it? And I was always in awe of good broadcast journalists because they said it. They said so much by saying so little. So there's a vignette. There's war, fighting, village, people got killed. One group was surrounded by another group, was surrounded by another group, and there was some fighting. I've lost you. And quite rightly so. It's complicated. So there's this journalist, and he tells his cameraman, he says, he has in his mind, how am I going to convey a point I want to make? He says, right, okay, set your camera up there, and he points at a road, and a UN vehicle, a UN armoured personnel carrier, with caterpillar tracks, like a real meaty military thing, rolls from right to left along the road, and makes the shot. That's the shot he wants, okay? He wants, basically, a tank rolling across the screen. His camera is still, tripod is set up, 90 degrees to the road, pointing at the road, and the vehicle goes across, traces across the thing. So this is the vision of this guy. This is like 9:30 in the morning, bullets, death, mortars, chaos, uncertainty, checkpoints. Hours later, at his edit, I watched him work. And he's got 90 seconds. His guys in London say, oh, look, yeah, we got politics here, we got sport there, we got current affairs there. No, give us 90 seconds. He could talk for hours. So he's got 90 seconds. So he describes in his payoff line, he wanted to describe how hopeless the international community's involvement in sorting out this terrible, terrible conflagration was. And he had this picture, he'd already set it up in his mind, and his payoff line was this. He described, in the first 60, 70 seconds, the fighting, complexity, blah, blah, alluded to, mortars, 6 children dead, blah, blah, blah. And he said, and in this combat, the UN has a roll-on part, and that's when they ran the thing. And in this conflict, the UN has a roll-on part, and it just trundles this tank across the, and that just conveys it all. You don't need to go into long issues about diplomacy and complexity and compromise and all. It's just a perfect thing. So say a lot by saying little. In public, who are my good speakers? I was never a great fan of Barack Obama. I mean, he was very well scripted. He had good script writers. Who are our good speakers in the modern era, in the contemporary era? I wonder if you could name.
Well,
only done it once. Trump has distorted, has poisoned the well so much with his, living in Africa. I remember him talking about Nimbia. Yeah, the people of Nimbia, a country that doesn't exist. And all the malapropisms and the muddles and the bigly, I'm the bigly clever, I'm so bigly clever, I'm the bigly cleverest president in the history of America. All of that. It's kind of poisoned the well. We kind of almost can't see past it.
Yeah, but he's just really funny. I wouldn't think of him necessarily. He obviously is a good communicator, although it's a begrudging thing to admit. But he's just got intense comedic value. But I think, beyond the short attention span, I don't know if he'll be remembered as one of our great communicators, although who am I to say that? He probably will be, actually. But I'm thinking a fella, he's not of the modern age. He's since passed away, and I think there's a high chance you probably have met him. But Christopher Hitchens was, in my eyes, the greatest talker I've ever listened to.
Well, I didn't meet him. I know of him and the brotherhood, his brother Peter, and the relationship and the complexity, their journey that they went on.
Unfortunately, Peter wasn't born with the same gift of oratory.
but they were both sort of, we would call them controversialists. They really were very good at pulling the donkey's tail, whatever the issue was. Even cricket. I mean, they're both into their sport, if I remember correctly. I have a mate who was a mate of both of those. He was a big sports guy. They used to play on the same, knockabout cricket team. Yeah, I know. But you made a good point about Trump, and you used the word begrudging, and I begrudge it. But the guy's ability to communicate, even though I don't recognize the value of what he's saying, the content, the way he does it, framing. He has a genius. I would call it a dark genius. 2 words, were all he needed to neutralize an entire front upon which he could be criticized. And those words were fake news. By introducing fake news into the lexicon, into the discourse, any media that you don't like, that any public person doesn't like now, they just roll their eyes, fake news. And at his rallies, he would say fake news, the entire crowd would turn around, look at the press pit, and it was really terrifying. That I've got friends who were in those press pits, separated by fences, and there are the great bearded and tattooed ladies of the Appalachian Mountains, surging towards the fence. I mean, really scary stuff, and demonizing them and weaponizing it. But it just took 2 words, and that stopped the New York Times in its tracks. No Washington Post story ever landed, ever bruised Trump. No story ever bruised him. No news story, because he used 2 words, and that's powerful.
Yeah,
proof. But I guess there's running with your. Sorry,
you could give him credit for being a terrific propagandist, right? Because that's that fake news that obviously just came to him, or at least one gets the sense it just came to him in the moment, and obviously it took off. So did build the wall. So did lock her up. Beautifully short phrases that just capture so much emotion and so much resentment, which he could rally behind. But does that then give him? Does he then get the credit of being a great communicator on the other side of that?
I fear so. I mean, not a speaker in terms of conveying ideas or convincing people. Not speaker. Yeah, I wonder if it's. You might say that Trump was very good at releasing a constituency, giving a voice to a constituency. He didn't have to give them any content. He didn't have to give them any. Their values were already clear. You're not persuaded. Trump never persuaded anybody. And for me, the great speaker is someone who can take person A, who's got values, opinion A, and say, actually, I've held on to A for a long time, but I'm changing it to B. For me, Trump was always preaching to the converted. His constituency, his congregation were already zealots. They didn't need any converting. They knew exactly what they want. They had the mindset: federal government bad, individualism right, white good, black bad, America great again, implying that there was some narrative where America was once great, which is code for a white-dominated society. All this crass, obvious stuff. It was known, and to them, and he was like a sort of he. So I wonder, a speaker, now running with it a little bit, where do we come across speakers in our modern world? I guess we come across speakers in, I'm thinking, am I allowed to say TED Talks? TED Talks, dominant, feature, dominant world of, in the space we're talking, which is exchanging ideas on the internet. They did well to be ahead of the game. TED Talks are convincing. It's interesting how people now introduce themselves. Blah, 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 I am X, I'm a TED Talker, or TEDx. And that's it's a reference that people can pick up and understand. What else do they know? Politicians, yes, clearly. Media people. It's interesting for me. Many of your listeners will be familiar with the TV program Succession, and Succession had a very nice line that really kind of stuck with me, which was, they're sort of funky. The idea, it's a fictional story of a multimedia headed, billion dollar value. Yeah, they all know. But there's a phrase in there where one of the sons, Ken, says, yeah, that's just legacy media, meaning newspapers, radios, and broadcast. That's the stuff that's my industry, that's my profession, that's my love, that's my oxygen, that's my space, that was my comfort space. And in one word, he put me in a box marked legacy. Legacies, that means old, belongs to history,
outdated.
Clinging on, outdated, not fresh, not new, not tomorrow.
Therefore
that's
not relevant.
Therefore not relevant. And that was really powerful. But in the legacy media world, if you were a journalist, if you had the confidence to choose what material was put out there, which is code 4, which is a word of describing editing. Editing is simply deciding what listeners or readers should be, or viewers should be engaged with. And if you think about it for a second, it's a really powerful thing. Editing, a million things happened in 1800, but the editor of that newspaper in 1800 had an incredible choice, incredible power, because there were a limited number of media outlets. Very, very powerful. Similarly, a million things still happen today. Editing is about choice. Anyway, the point about editors, journalists, columnists, whatever, is that they have to have a certain degree of courage and skill in editing, right? In choosing, in prioritizing. And one thing they often would be challenged to do is, if they were a newspaper editor, they'd be asked to go onto a broadcast to defend their choices, to defend, what are your opinions? You've said this in this national newspaper, you've said this. In the Australian context, you've come out as a Republican. Come and explain that. Supporting the Republican cause, having been a royalist for a long time, a monarchist, supporting whatever the issue is. And in the old days, those editors would get a microphone and a pair of cans and sit there and go to a broadcast studio and have the eloquence and the confidence to convey their point. Hitchens, both brothers, part of that world. Write a column, very provocative, in The Spectator or in Marxism Today, whichever Hitchens was, whether in their communist phase, their Marxist phase, or their capitalist phase. But they were brave enough to go. Anyway, today, you would be amazed. Editors of newspapers, you wouldn't be able to name them. In Britain, there used to be figures. There used to be really grown-up figures, like public figures. They'd be out there once a week on a Question Time in the BBC, on a big radio show, whatever, just arguing their corner. Now, no, anonymous, lost. And I find that quite intriguing. Anyway, we've gone off on a sort of funny directional thing about speaking and thing. I just think that, in our modern world, we have a blizzard. Any consumer, anyone interested, anyone intelligent, anyone curious has a blizzard of sources. And so, if you are someone who's lucky enough to be given the privilege of a microphone and a dice, a platform to stand on, and the opportunity to speak, then you better be bloody good at it, because you got to make, there are lots of other things that are going to get other people's attention.
Yeah, I'm not worried about the tangent going on at all, just because I find it to be, obviously it's got nothing to do with your book, which we'll get to, but it's such an interesting question to me. What makes a great speaker, therefore what makes a good writer, and what makes ultimately a great communicator? Because I would argue that it's the most important transferable skill. It affects absolutely every single aspect of your life. Your relationships are, by one metric, only as good as how well you can reflect what you're thinking to them and then understand what they're thinking to you. And if you've got, a limited means of being able to brain to mouth it, then just by the nature of that, the relationship will therefore not be as rich and as deep as it potentially could have been otherwise. Professionally, obviously, if you can communicate, it's huge. It's so huge. So I am like always trying to collect as many anecdotes or other experiences as possible from, in my opinion, good communicators, to see like what is it that makes you a good communicator? Is it simply just the fact that you are kind of born with it? Obviously, Hitchens was reading voraciously from the earliest time he could. Obviously, that's a huge contributor to him being able to communicate very well. He has a very, very large pool of sentences and sort of moods to say a story to pull on. It's all in his subconscious. I don't think he can consciously bring it up, but anyway, it's there. I would say you're the same. I mean, you were writing copy for how many years, right? You'd be in the top 1% of people of all time who have written words. Therefore, you sort of have downstream of that, a nice way to communicate. So this is why I'm thinking of it. I think it's really important. And as well, like you've mentioned many times, away from the legacy media, maybe towards more podcasting, towards more Twitter, brevity, how much emotion and meaning can you pack into a short little sentence, a short little tangent? I mean, it's probably never been more valuable to be an elite communicator.
Well, interesting points. I never really thought about it in those terms, but it goes back to Roman oratory. I mentioned that thing: educate, enlighten, and inspire. I'm gonna educate you. I'm gonna lift you up, and I'm gonna actually I'm gonna inspire you. is the perfect oratory. And that was, I can't forgive me, I'm going to get it wrong, Cato, Cicero, Cassius, someone in the Roman Forum. And that echoes down through time. If you do take a speaking class, that's often referred to by your instructor. What do I say? I guess I'm lucky because I'm a journalist. Journalists, we're just curious, professionally curious. We're nosy. We find stuff out. We don't deep dive. We're not academics. We don't take our borehole really, really fine, tight. We are confident enough, willing to compromise enough, flabby enough to go wide. You mentioned Hitchens' reading. For me, I know no greater pleasure than reading and learning, and I'm just eternally curious. And I hope that gives me a perspective to share. I guess one skill set you need that might not have been so valuable in the legacy media era, but the modern era, is the ability to see interconnectedness, to see how an issue of this. Now, before we were recording, we were talking about sport, and I love the way you saw how issues about nationalism connect with and we went off on about sport. We went on a riff, dear listener, dear viewer. We were just chatting beforehand, but suddenly it was like pouring. It was like putting a flame to some spilled petrol. We were just talking over each other with enthusiasm because we saw of a linkage, and I'm all about linkage. I'm all about seeing connections, because connections convince. Haha, that's a funny sort of alliterative tool there. If you're a listener, I find if someone makes that connection, and that's convincing. That sticks in my head because I'm making a connection between, I don't know, today's interest in gender and the suffragette movement. I just find there are some issues, for example, I find quite extraordinary that were so that if you just flew in your mind really high and just said, let's just forget the actual content of what being debated. Just notice from this height the change. Up until women got the vote in the UK, in Britain, people fought about it. I mean, they actually literally fought in the streets. Women with placards would hit men, or that's crudely speaking, there were obviously men and women on both sides, over the heads with placards. People died. A woman died. Simply threw herself in front of a horse and died. Others of her friends went to jail. They scratched messages on the walls of their jail cells, which are no different from an IRA terrorist. And the reason I link it in my mind, because weirdly enough, Gavrilo Princip, my First World War obsession, the assassin from Sarajevo from 1914, he scratched things on the wall. And I just thought, why scratch the wall? This is a person. He's a guy with a gun. This is a woman with a skirt and a placard. All she wants is the vote. If you then the picture I'm painting is of violent, turbulent disagreement. I mean, disagreement so acute it would lead to violence. About 5 nanoseconds after that vote was passed, that gave women the vote, all of that anger, all of that violence has gone, poof, disappeared, and people look back and go, "What was the fuss about? Of course, women get the vote." Gay rights in the UK, in my lifetime, single sex, the rights of gay couples to adopt children. In the 1960s and 70s, unthinkable. People get angry, waving their Bibles around, saying things which, I don't even want to say them now, but you can imagine the language that was used. When the legislation, about 5 nanoseconds later, everyone's going to look back and say, oh, it's just a bunch of happy kids and happy families over there. They just happen to have 2 dads or 2 mums, or whatever the phrasing is, whatever the language people are comfortable with. And there are some issues that people get so het up about that when they're decided, they just it's not just that the anger is earthed. You actually look back and you think, how the hell could we have got so angry about that? How the hell do you get so angry about those issues? So that begs a question in my mind. That's interesting. From a sort of drone point of view, you see things that are people get so angry about, which actually, once settled, are gone, finished, khalas. We laugh about it. My question is, what are the issues today that we're angry about? that when they're going to be settled, we're going to look back and go, oh. And so that is a human behavioural pattern I observe, which I want to project forward. And I would ask, for example, broadly speaking, we were talking about nationalism in our conversation. Land, borders, that phrase, I'll die for king and country. Actual land. Pro patria mori. There is nothing better than to die pro patria mori, for your fatherland. Forgive the linguistic. In the patrimony, women don't get a look in. It's not a motherland, it's a fatherland. But the point is, people die. And I've seen that Tim Marshall thing, people die in Kosovo and die in Bosnia. And 5 nanoseconds after the bullets stop firing, you argue, why the hell, what was it all about? What was achieved? Because nothing substantive. No, let me get that wrong. Very rarely is anything substantive achieved. Afghanistan, American soldiers, Australian special forces dragging the good name of the Australian special forces through the mud. They lose their moral compass. They lose their true north. The British, the same. Dead, hundreds of dead Brits. 3,000 dead coalition soldiers. 168,000 dead Afghans. And they pull out in August of 2021. And the guys they'd got rid of, they're back on their motorbikes. And you just think, wow, what was it all about? So my question is, sometimes we need to look at things and take that perspective and go, whoa, what are we so angry about today that when it's settled is going to be just a case of, was it worth it? Because it could save a lot of suffering.
Do you have a sense for what that might be?
I don't have a sense of what it might be, but I do have a sense for we should be aware. When at parsing an issue, you should be aware how is it going to end up? What's it going to achieve if we burn this bridge and kill these? Let me give you an example. Let me give you a funny little vignette. You can imagine Europe. Everyone pictures Europe and everyone pictures European history. A lot of men on horses with swords, a lot of soldiers with white crosses on their tummies where the bandoliers cross, shoot here in Waterloo, whatever. Fight for borders, okay, and control and power. On the Swiss-French border, so right at the bottom of, Spanish-French border, right at the bottom of France on the Pyrenees at the left-hand end of the Atlantic end, there is a border town with a river, and it has an island in the middle of it, and it goes by Pheasant Island. It's named Pheasant Island, and it's on the border. And over the years there has been fighting, because you can tell, because guess what? The local town's got a castle. That town over there has got another castle. They were built because they didn't get on with each other. Yada, 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 yada. There's this island, Pheasant Island. Guess what? Today, in today's environment, in 2023, for half the year, that island is sovereign French. And guess what happens at month 6? It becomes sovereign Spain. And then 6 months later, what happens? It flips back. And I just love that as a sort of example of the absolute
arbitrary nature of a border or
with the arbitrary nature, I was thinking of the trivialization, putting into perspective what all of that blood and powder is that was used to build those castles and settle those scores, and which princess married which Dutch, which duke, and all the fighting that went with it, and the vanity and the tariffs and the commercial strains across that border, and for some years it was in French hands, and 3 centuries it was in Spanish hands, and whatever. It just trivializes the whole thing and puts it into perspective. And that allows me in my historical drone really high to go, wow, that's how we should do borders. That really is how we should do borders. 6 months a year, you could be A. 6 months a year, you can be B. And I love that. There.
Yeah. I think if we don't transition to Africa now, we'll miss the entire podcast. So on the subject of good writers, tell us a little bit about this Greene fella.
Well, you say, as we discussed earlier, the greatest writers are the ones that write things that stay with you, and they do it with brevity. Greene, he was an astonishing 20th century English man of letters. So born 1904, dies 1991. So he basically runs the gamut of the 20th century. London, born in Berkhamsted outside London, but basically London-based, but an inveterate traveller. He was, for me, an astonishing straddler. He straddled different worlds, media, newspaper journalist, but he could write film, he could write film reviews, he could write novels, he could write plays, he could write non-fiction. There wasn't anything he didn't turn his hand to, he didn't do very well. But his value, what makes him unique, is a sense of prescience. He was ahead of the game. He saw things before others and he captured it. So I mean, I can be flippant and say, this is a man of vision. This is a man who has an amazing imagination. He writes a novel, he could actually imagine a quiet American. Can you believe it? A quiet one. American. So his novel is called The Quiet American. And where are we? We're in Indochina. Okay, Indochina is a complicated place. Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand. Where are we? But we're in a period when America is getting is being tempted to get involved in a far away land because it thinks crucial foundational principles are at stake. We hear the story told through an opium consuming journalist, a British journalist who meets an American, a young American who is quiet. And it turns out he's, got a sort of military agenda. And that might sound a bit Netflixy and a bit kind of, drama. This guy's writing in the 1950s, early 60s, so he's like 60 years back, 50 years back. And it's the greatest novel that captures the folly of the Vietnam War ever written, including by American writers. And weirdly, it also captures the folly of all of the things we talked about earlier, which is Bosnia and Kosovo and the Balkans and Iraq and Afghanistan. Any time when an international, when a foreign superpower thinks, I know best, I'm going to wade in, I know best. And the phrase in Vietnam was a third force. We'll introduce a third force. You had the locals, local capitalists, local communists, and a third force will come in. Anyway, so Greene has always intrigued me because he's there. As a child, you're traumatized at school because you're forced to read his novels and your O-level English, but then if you watch your movies, if you know a film called The Third Man, if you're into film study, you're often told Third Man is the greatest film ever made.
Really?
You must watch it.
I've never even heard of it. I got to go have a look.
You better have. We're in a very odd place. We're in Vienna in 1946-47. Not a place that's very sexy, because Berlin is where it's all happening, right? But Greene drops in and he writes a script. And there's music. The music to The Third Man. Let me tell you how popular, let me tell you how dominant that movie is. There's a movie house in Vienna which plays The Third Man 2 or 3 times a day on a screen every day and has done since 1962.
Wow.
Can you believe? There's an audience who will queue up and pay cash money to sit down. People come now in clothes and dress up and do the music, and they've obviously seen the film a million times. Because it captures the mood. It captures... You asked a very pertinent question about good speaking earlier, or good... And then it was also part of good. What is good writing? I wonder if I could add a little postscript. With writing, I talked about, does it stay with you? I wonder if I could say, if writing or an issue or the way that someone captures the time, it captures to use that German phrase, Zeitgeist. It somehow frames perfectly the Geist of that Zeit, of that time, the spirit of that time. And Greene somehow did. Anyway, so I digress. So the guy's very versatile. He writes film, he writes novels, he writes non-fiction, he writes poetry. By his own admission, pretty shit poetry, but whatever, and non-fiction. So he's a man of letters. But what connected me to him is that he had this strong desire to travel. He was born in a middle-class English home. His father was a teacher, headmaster of a minor English public school, so he was brought up in a public school environment. But you could see throughout his life, he just looked beyond the horizons. He looked over the horizon. I want to go there. Here is known, there is unknown, and it's the unknown. You can respond to that in the number of human responses to those two realities, known and unknown. One response is, yep, I'm happy with known, thank you very much, I'm not going any further. Unknown is, and there's another which is, ooh, unknown, I'm off. And I guess my connection with Greene is that I'm like that. I want to know what's over the horizon. I want to know what's in that dark hole. I want to know what's at the top of the mountain. I want to know what's in the deep valley. I want to know what's at the bottom of the sea, sort of thing. And Greene always did that, and he travelled. And how did he travel? He's born 1904, so he's coming of age during the Great Depression. The world's going to shit. He leaves university, he struggles for a job, does a job in the UK, in a British newspaper, famous newspaper, The Times. We've already alluded to The Times in this earlier on in this conversation. You can actually see, I'm kind of interested in him because he was a journalist who broke away from journalising to write books, and he found it tough. He found it really tough. You got a pitch invader behind you. You got a cat, a feline pitch invader has just joined your study. The door. I put the cat to sleep with my dulcet tones. He'll fall into deep sleep. Anyway, Greene, and so that was interesting for me because there's a certain familiarity. I'm no writer as Greene. I'm nowhere near. I'd be so presumptuous, but I would make this connection: is that he was at Oxford, he struggled, blah blah. Was a newspaper person, broke off but he goes to Africa to challenge himself, to go on his first ever major journey. His first journey outside Europe was 1935, and he goes to Africa. But he doesn't go to regular Africa. He goes to off-piste Africa. And the off-piste Africa beguiles him so much, challenges him, and also leaves him admitting he doesn't understand. There are so many things he didn't understand that he keeps coming back to Africa. And you see it throughout his career. So this is the 1930s. He goes as a writer to explore a journey. He then comes back in the Second World War to serve in Africa, in Sierra Leone, in West Africa, a little bit in Nigeria. He then comes back in the 1950s during the Mama Revolution in Kenya to explore that. He then comes back to the Congo in the late 50s, early 60s to explore there. He then comes back to Cameroon. And he then comes to South Africa in the 1970s. So he's got a constant theme through his life, his connection with Africa, because it challenges him, because it's so unfathomable, and yet because it is so fundamental to all of us. We are all African. It's African evolved DNA that's in your bloodstream in as much as it's in mine and in all of our listeners. We forget our African roots, and he went back. His first trip, 1935. He is relatively poor. He's not successful. He's had a couple of novels published, but one is successful in as much as it's made some money for him. But that's not enough. You can't live on it. So his plan was, I'll go, I will explore, I'll write a non-fiction book because it will give me I'll do the research, and then I'll write a fiction. Then I will confect something. And that was pretty much a methodology he used for the rest of his life. He would travel, write a non-fiction, write some non-fiction, and then write a novel. Going back to The Quiet American, he did go to Indochina. He did go to Saigon in the 1950s. He was there himself for a long period. He did smoke opium. He did explore. So he got the authenticity right, and he wrote journalism about it. That was his non-fiction. And then he writes The Quiet American.
I love that so much.
Just forgive me. I've just got to rush back slightly. I've got to spin back as well. So I said he was prescient. He writes a novel. So there's a phrase in common vernacular now, which is when you talk about a diplomat, you say it's our man in Moscow or our woman in Washington. It's our. There's just in that phrasing, just in that structure, it conveys the slight pomposity of diplomacy. The national, it's ours. That person is ours. So he writes a novel, Our Man in Havana. Okay, and that's where that phrasing and vernacular comes from. Just the title of his book, Our Man in Havana, and it is almost a comedy. It's the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis period. He's born in 1904, so he's coming of age during the Cold War, after the Second World War, and he's seeing the follies of the capitalist paradigm, and remembering that at university he used to know some doctrinal communists, and people who really believed in communism to such an extent they became spies for the Soviet Union. So he dances on that edge between the two. And he writes this wonderful piss take of Western values. And the piss take is this, that a vacuum cleaner salesman in Cuba who's down on his luck sees that the world is, the capitalist world, the communist, the developed West is so obsessed with nasty communist threats that he, in order to survive, because he's down on his luck, he's completely lost his, he drinks too much, he's hopeless, got no money, is he come up with a bullshit story about missiles in Cuba, and he's got the missile plan. He's managed to get a special copy of it from his friends who've overlooked this, a Soviet agent, and they pass it to the CIA. And the plan is the instruction manual for a vacuum cleaner. So you can imagine a vacuum cleaner has pictures of pods and like long plastic things. That is fed to the CIA. And in the novel, the CIA guy is so blinded by this communist paranoia. Oh my God, they are missile pods. He can't see the wood for the trees. He can't see that this is literally a vacuum cleaner nozzle. And then so we have this whole dance. So the premise is a context of the world where people are so paranoid that a chancer can bullshit the CIA because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The CIA is so convinced that the Soviets are coming with their missiles that this guy, and so he gets his money. If that's fiction, written in the 1960s, if I go to 2001 in Iraq, we have a vacuum cleaner salesman, who sees that the context is so paranoid and so post 9/11 mad, he can make a turn on this. He speaks to the Americans. He makes it known. He speaks to, a gullible CIA guy, and he says, "Yeah, weapons of mass destruction. They're everywhere. He's got them here. He's got them there. Anthrax here. Sarin the other. Mustard gas. Ballistic missiles." His name, the code name, was Curveball. That's all out in the congressional reports. This is reality, not fiction. And Greene, 50 years before, is doing a piss-take fiction, which frankly is a direct description of what happened in 2001, 2003, which leads up to the invasion of Iraq and all the destabilizing of the world order, which has followed from that. And that's why I like Greene. He's just kind of cheeky and prescient. He takes the piss in a wise way, and the wisdom is that he's making points. I mean, God, he captured the gullibility of us, not just the CIA, us, the developed world. We all wanted to project that Saddam's a bad guy narrative to such an extent that we invaded Iraq. And in invading Iraq, we destabilized the entire Middle East. We drove Iran, the Shia star, higher into the sky than it ever has been. We slipped across into Afghanistan. All of the folly that's gone, all of the Chinese, taking over the hegemony, Russia's nationalism, everything. Syria, ISIS, the Syrian, the Russian military might on display in Syria leads directly to 2014 in Crimea, and then 2022 in Ukraine. I mean, you can draw a line, and it all comes from gullibility. And Greene was writing a novel about it 50 years ago. So he's kind of cool. I find him kind of cool. Many of your listeners will know him. Those who don't will read novels that are inspired by him. Not explicitly Graham Greene novels, but he's a great 20th century man of letters. And he does this journey in his first African journey is a big breakout moment for him. And he goes to a crazy remote West African country called Liberia, which is a coastal West African state created in a very complicated, post-modern, morally confused way, born out of the American Civil War. We're over in America now. You have freed slaves. You have the issue of slavery, that cancer at the core, the heart, that tumor that America still hasn't cauterized or dealt with. And they have freed slaves. What do you do with freed slaves? Do you accommodate them into your society? Okay, you do. Or maybe you give them, there might be a religious fervor to say, I'm sorry, we enslaved you, now we can go back to Africa. And there was a movement to move people back to Africa amongst a certain white American class in about the 1860s, 1870s. And Liberia is born of that. Freed African-American slaves dropped on the coast of Africa. So that begs the question. Was there anyone there before? Yes, there was. There was a community. And so the friction in Liberia is between those outsiders dropped by the United States of America, and the inside is Liberia. And it was interesting, blah, blah, and Greene decides he wants to go explore this place because in the 1930s, it was like a top international issue. The League of Nations had its first ever inquiry, was into Liberia. Why was it interested? Because a country created by freed slaves, with the word liberty in its name, Liberty, Liberia, had started to slave. Those imported Liberians, those freed slaves from America, had turned up with their money, their gunpowder, their top hats, their education, and they'd seen the locals and they actually slaved them. It was an extraordinary moral thing, flip, freed slaves becoming slavers. And very illuminating for how humans can behave, how we do, our memories are short, and how greed can overcome so many things. And Greene basically went there to spy, to see was slaving going on, because in the late 20s, early 30s, there'd been a State Department inquiry, there'd been a League of Nations inquiry. The president of Liberia had been forced out. It was amazing. It was the only time the League of Nations, between its creation in 1919 at the Treaty of Paris and its collapse in 1939 with the Abyssinian thing, it was the only time the League of Nations really showed its teeth. It was the first major thing. And they got rid of a president, which is extraordinary. Imagine the United Nations forcing Saddam Hussein out, just by the United Nations. Anyway, they did. And that was 1931. And by about 1935, the rumour was, they're slaving again. So the world didn't know what was going on, and it was such a remote place, just so fabulously remote. Greene says, at the age of 30-odd, 34, 35, I'll go. And he goes as a bit of a spy, a little baby spy for the British, friends of friends, and a journalist. And he writes a book, and it's so remote, the book captures it in its title. I've already talked about the, Our Man in Nirvana and the Quiet American. He's good at titles. His book was called Journey Without Maps. Bingo, there you go. That tells you. We're going to a place where it's unmapped. And he goes there, has an extraordinary trip. And this segues a little bit back to anyone who endured my last discussion with you, is that Blood River was born of a personal sense of, Congo is, I knew it as a journalist. I felt some almost sort of custodial responsibility because of this sort of Telegraph newspaper connection to it, but I was daunted by it. I didn't understand it. I wanted to go back and use a journey to unlock a history. I'd been to Sierra Leone and Liberia in the 1990s, and they were terrifying places. It was the period of Blood Diamonds, the movie that people might reference. You might remember the images of child amputees, rebels hacking limbs off. It's extraordinary. Some of the worst icons. And I'd been there, and friends had died. Guys who. Two journalists who, Tim Marshall, who we were riffing about at the beginning of this conversation, would have known from Bosnia, a man called Kurt Schork, an American called Kurt Schork, and a Spaniard, a Catalan called Miguel Gil Moreno, and they were killed when I was there. It was terrifying. I ran away from that place, daunted, but I kind of wanted to go back to undaunted, to undaunt myself, to get this bogey off my back. And Greene's journey was the way to do it. He'd been there in the 1930s. He'd walked it. And he left a diary with names of villages. And if that's going to be authentic, then the theory was quite simple. I'll go find those villages. They're not on any marked maps, or very few of them are on any marked maps. I'll go there and see if the diary works. Anyway, I did. And so a very, very long answer to your question, who's this guy Graham Greene? I've riffed on who he was and how he went to Africa, and he inspired me to go, and I went off and followed his route and had an extraordinary journey. Again, a bit like Blood River, yep. The challenge is to do a journey to tell a story.
Amazing. And so just to put on the timeline for the audience, you've done this several years after the completion of Blood River, and it was your second time back into Liberia, having almost had a death threat, I think, made against you. So you were very nervous about returning to the country.
There's no almost about it.
Right, okay.
It wasn't almost had a death threat.
So
there was one. The president is a guy that people remember, Charles Taylor. He's currently in jail on war crimes. A good place for him. Sadly, he enjoys a justice that none of his victims are able to enjoy. He was in power.
He is truly one of the boogeymen of history, surely. is.
He's certainly boogeyman of African history and modern history.
Yeah,
I mean,
maybe you could say a little bit about him, how it's this complete psychopathic personality who is also met with tons of liquid cash and pretty much unbridled power and weapons.
So I mentioned that Liberia is a country with a fault line, a clear political fault line between those who came from outside, who were freed African American slaves from the North America, and those who live in the country, known as upcountry or upline Liberians. So crudely speaking, it's outsiders and insiders, both of whom are black African, which is why Liberia is a fascinating example, because you get away from the white colonial framing of so many questions. This is outsiders against insiders, but everybody is the same color. So how do you behave morally? That's the big fault line. The country's created in the mid-19th century. It lurches along acute poverty, and we end up... there were moments when the outside powers cared about it enough to invest. America regarded it as not a colony. It had a nice phrase. It said it's like a godchild. Some sort of connection, an informal connection. So America has a strong influence there. Voice of America had a big radio broadcasting station there. The airport in Liberia was important militarily for the United States Air Force. Can you believe they extended it so that the Challenger shuttle, the space shuttle, if it overshot, if the rotation, if it overshot landing in California, was it Andrews or Edwards Air Base, they needed a big strip of tarmac over in Africa so they could land this thing close to the equator. So they built one. Massive. It has a little Second World War history because, again, it's strategically important. If you're going to stop U-boats in the Atlantic, where would you put your ships? America was there. They worked at the airport. There's a rather sweet memory from this, is that the Americans arrived at this airport in the Second World War and built facilities, but a big fence up, very much like Afghanistan in 2010, very much like Iraq in 2003. Big fence outside, inside America, burgers and everything. Can you believe the village today outside the airport in Liberia in the 21st century is called Smell Nor Taste. Smell Nor Taste. And if you could hear my voice, that's a sort of pidgin way, because that's Liberian English. You can smell, but you can't taste. Smell nor taste. And it means that these poor kids in villages of this will be outside the fence smelling all this lovely food, barbecues being made, grills, chips frying, in an American safe space, but outside, no taste. So smell nor taste. So America has this funny rule, but it's acutely poor and institutionally weak, falls to pieces. Long preamble, into a space of weak institutions and weak political control appears a monster. That monster is Charles Taylor. He is Liberian. Yep. He'd spent some time in America. A lot of Liberians have a very strong connection there. He'd been jailed in America. He'd escaped from jail. He was a fraudster. I mean, he was not a violent man. He's just a cheap, stole someone's money. Ends up back in the area, in the country, and he has his eyes start to sparkle. It's so weak. There's a rebel leader there. I could take him on. So he gets some backing and some money. And he gets some money from, of all people, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Libya was the great backer. He raids into the country, and it's memorable because he raids in on Christmas Eve, 1989. And he raids in, and that's how it's remembered, the Christmas Eve attack. And they lurch across the border. And then all of the worst images of your mind, your stereotypes of African fighting, happen now. It's child soldiers. It's drugged up soldiers. It's voodoo fetishist soldiers. It's soldiers in ball gowns and wigs and combat boots running around because the wigs protect them. Famously, one soldier who was known as, I think he was called Butt Naked. Corporal Butt Naked became Captain Butt Naked, and it's in the name. He didn't wear any clothes. He wore boots because the magic didn't protect him from thorns on the ground, but the idea was the magic protected him from the bullets. So it was that, and it sounds kind of weird, macabre, strange. But there's nothing remotely jocular about what these guys did. They would get to villages, they would attack. They didn't have any other tactic apart from terror. So you terrify the villagers, you kill people, and then that swings the village. So that village will now do as it's told because they've seen people die. And he takes control, eventually, nasty war, and is in control for a number of years. He used to use the word psychopath. I don't think that's inappropriate. He stole all the money, whatever was being created in the nation. They have a rubber industry there, some vestigial mining, agriculture. He took a slice of everything, made sure that there was no meaningful development. The only thing that developed was his foreign bank accounts. His son was like straight out of Miami Vice, central casting, dark glasses, drove around in a big Jeep in town, bunch of security guys on the back with machine guns, shot people in the street, no accountability. Chucky, the son was called Chucky Taylor. Charles Taylor and his son Chucky. So it was almost as if Hollywood scriptwriters had said, come up with your worst ones and then we'll project it from fiction into reality. Life will imitate art. And that ran for a number of years, and I was there towards the end of his regime, and he didn't like something I wrote, so I was out of the country by the time we published it, which was Relief, and I knew it was be controversial, and he put a death threat on me. And I'd like to say that made me special, but he was quite big on death threats. He was ousted by another rebel group within 2 years of that, a year and a half, and after during the period when I went there, when he was in power, I couldn't even go a mile down the road, 3 miles down the road. It was madness. You couldn't. Checkpoints, as I said, soldiers, kids, guns, drugs. We're a strange feature in Liberia. You know how when we were kids, we all had popsicles, those little icy, little plastic sleeves, tiny plastic sleeves with fruit cordial inside, which your mum and dad have frozen, or you buy in the corner shop, popsicles. Exactly the same in Liberia, but 40% alcohol. So you would find kids sucking on 40% gin, 40% whiskey, alcohol things. And that, if you can imagine sort of taking your brain function and overlaying 10 of those in the morning, then that kind of adds to this miasma, moral miasma. I mean, just kids off their faces, adults who are... Cannibalism is it's not common in terms of cannibalism for sustenance. Cannibalism is ritualistic. I have an enemy, I'm going to eat I'm going to take their power, and I do that by opening up their chest and eating their spleen. And that happened. Sadly, that's not fiction, that's reality. So, pretty grim place. And he did put a death threat on me, but he does go after the rebel force. Another rebel force ousts him. And by this time, the international community has sorted out the other festering wound in the area, which is the neighbouring country, Sierra Leone. There's a UN force, there's a peacekeeper. Anyway, it stabilises. And that's when I go back. And I go back when it's much more stable. Taylor's gone. And I go on this journey that Greene made in the 1930s. And if you forgive me, because I do riff a bit, there I am at the beginning of this thing. So good speaking is all about brevity, and hardly a very... brief, and hardly being very brief now, but I take a guide on this journey, and one vignette sticks in my mind. Early on in the first few days of us walking together, we walked for about 35 days. The conversation naturally turns to the war. What happened to you during the war? His name is Johnson Boy is his name. So I asked Johnson, what happened to you in the war? He said, well, I came from this village. And he just told me this story. He said, and then the rebels arrived, and I was outside the village. And this is, literally, if you scripted this for Blood Diamonds, it would, I'm in the bushes watching, and then they round up people, they put them in a container, a shipping container, which happens to be, like an old shipping container, which is there, which delivered some goods, and they set a fire around it. So basically, they roast to death. Burning isn't the right word. They actually roast to death. The chief's kids, prominent women, prominent men, have many, 20, 30, 40. But the point of the story is that Johnson said, yeah, I could remember the guy. He was from Taylor's people. He came from the Mano tribe, which is over on the border with Ivory Coast, because as he came in from Ivory Coast, he picked up these particular villages, and this particular thug came from this, and he had a name. I won't remember the name. It's in my book, but it's forgive me. Remember that. And he said, yeah, that couple, he was evil. He was the guy who ran this, and I watched this, and then I ran away, and then he had a new life, he became a refugee, and blah, 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 blah. And then, but this is his scar that he bore, his mental scar, his trauma. And he named this guy. 20 days later, we're walking way over on the other side of the country. We're now in a region where the Mano are, okay, where these people, this tribal group which is on the Ivory Coast border. And I swear I saw Johnson go white. He just went silent. And the colour drained from his, bright, healthy, he was then in his late 20s cheeks. His eyes dimmed. He looked to the ground. I didn't know what the hell was going on. And then just, I knew enough to not ask. And as we cleared the village, because we were just in the routine of walking through villages, maybe buying some biscuits or asking the way or that, he said, he was there. I just saw him. So could you imagine a reality where your worst nightmare figure, your demon from a Hollywood movie, your vile, is it Johnny Kruger? Is it the guy with the mask in those films, the Halloween film? Freddy, thank you. Freddy Krueger. That image, that epitome of evil belongs on the silver screen, right? Belongs on a screen. Is horrible though it is, it's removed from us. Johnson saw his Freddy Krueger. He was alive. He's there, standing there. Because one thing about the Liberian War is that no war crimes, very few were ever held to account. Charles Taylor is actually in jail, not for crimes in Liberia, but for in Liberia and Sierre Leone. That's a separate issue we could touch on, but he was never jailed for Liberian stuff. It was such an awful Pandora's box. Don't open it. It's so horrible. Ugh. Leave it alone. Leave the box closed. Bury it under 6 foot of ground. We'll hope that lead box will keep the radiation in. So this guy had never been held to account, even though there was a lot of body of evidence against him. But forget lawyers and forget court cases. I saw Johnson go white. I'll never forget it. I'll never forget it. And that's how kind of psychopathic the regime was under Taylor. Very unpleasant. Truly the worst stereotypes of the African war. But I was there at a much more stable time. But it was for me, it was getting my devil off my back. I wanted to better understand how societies could unravel so spectacularly, so fundamentally. And so that's why I went back.
The book is called Chasing the Devil. You just mentioned a big part of Charles Taylor's regime was sort of embracing the bush magic, the black magic, the devil worship of some of these West African societies. You mentioned, General Butt Naked. There was, men wearing ball gowns and wigs, partly maybe because they were completely high on drugs, but then also partly because there was a, genuine belief that it was protection from the magic. You met a couple of characters throughout this journey. Dr. Junger, there was a Nazi doctor you found in a rural village. You touched on things such as, ritual murder. Are there still devil societies throughout Liberia and Sierra Leone?
Okay, so this exercise was really, for me, to fundamentally understand a society from which this war had emerged, both in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And I felt that reading books and sitting in university and staying in capital cities wasn't be enough, so I wanted to go to a journey. And so what I was very open-eyed to, which is that religion plays a really important part in a West African society, just as it does in any society, not when I'm in, the tradition that I'm from. Any of our readers, listeners, will be from. So the spiritual element is one of animism. It's not believing in monotheistic gods. It's not believing in a single god, a Christian god or an Islamic god or a Jewish god. It's believing in the power of talking to those who've gone before to guide those who come after. And it's completely normal in human developmental areas. Animism is spirit worship is absolutely, it's in our cultural DNA. Before Christianity in Britain, we had animism, we had paganism, we had all of these traditions. Before all the monotheistic, that's why monotheism was so spectacular, because it challenged an established order. The established order was we respect our elders. Ancient Rome, ancient Greece, it's all about the elders. And I was walking through these villages where superficially there might be a church or there might be a mosque, because both faiths are very prevalent. But what I've noticed and what was clear is that the actual faith was animistic, was spiritual. And who talks to the spirits, to the ancestors' spirits? Well, you need a voice, right? A way of communicating. And what's interesting about Sierra Leone and Liberia is they embrace this. It's fundamentally part of society, and they do that through using the device of masks. Humans wearing masks, masking. Again, very common. You see it in North America, Pacific tribes, lots of it, found by anthropologists in Australia. Masking. And the game is this: that we all know in the village there's the blacksmith. He's the big guy, and guess what? When the figure comes to talk to us, it's the big guy. We know who it is, but because it's the same leap of faith that Christians make a leap of faith when they take a wafer of biscuit and a sip of red wine. That this is the flesh and blood of Christ. It is exactly that same mindset of transfiguration. You put on a mask, put on a costume, and you're no longer the blacksmith, but you are the vector. You are the access to the ancestors. And the thing that's so powerful is that in Sierra Leone and Liberia, every village has one, and the word they use to describe them isn't doctor or witch doctor or sangoma or any of the other words that you often see, or shaman, words that we don't. They use this word. They use the word devil. It's the devil. The devil is speaking to us. And of course, coming from a Christian background, Judeo-Christian person, the devil is, whoa, it's all evil, right? The devil can only be giving dark. He's not a devil in that context. They use the word devil. He's a teacher. He's a medium. He's a sage. He's an oracle. He's a soothsayer. He is a seer. He sees forward. And this is Druidical Gaul has exactly the same thing. Guys with long beards, get a fix, cutting mistletoe, lotions and potions. So it's entirely consistent with all human society, but it was just so fascinating to watch what I had sensed was a sort of historical thing still be so current and so dominant and so actual. So I'm in villages, and every village had a devil. And Greene observed devils, and they would come out and they would perform. They would do trance dances. They would do dances and get into a trance. And in the trance state, they would see things, which is exactly what you get in Amazon. People, hipsters fly from London to the Amazon to get into a trance, don't they? And what's that stuff that you drink? Ayahuasca. And ayahuasca, you need to be in a sweaty, smoke-filled, tarpaulin-covered yak somewhere. Anyway, whatever. This is reality. But in order to talk to the ancestors, you need to get into a trance. In order to get into a trance, you might need to take this drug, you might need to dance for this period, you might be wearing a mask, and a costume adds to that temperature change. So you see all of these common elements. But the point about the story, or the point about it, is that I saw how society ticked. And in this journey, about 38 days of walking, really physically tough walking, really amazingly tough environment, humidity, lack of food, health issues. It was so enlightening to see how society, in order to survive in this environment, this was the societal glue. Just as the Christian church in the little villages that I'm from in England, societal glue was paid. The church, the minister, the vicarage, all of that connection, the role it played in keeping that society together. This was played by the devil. It's a powerful word, obviously, because it captures so many things. It conveys so many things. And I used it for the title of the book, Chasing the Devil. And I use it in a double word play. Devil as in the devil of these actual devils in religion, but also the devil of war. I'm chasing the devil of war. Is this, am I following the roots of war? Or am I chasing my own personal devils, my own demons, my own vanities? Anyways, so that's the conceit. And that was the journey, chasing the devil. We go off and I guess I went there with a certain preconceived mapping, that I thought, these devils are going to be bad, these devils are going to be this. I left in awe of the human spirit to survive in this environment. And spirit is important. You need the spirits to help you. Your dice are loaded against you. The water's got disease in it. The fruit bats will give you Ebola. It's really shit. The food, lack of food, really difficult to hack the jungle back to make a field. At one point I got to a place and he said, "Yeah, this is our rice field." And I looked out at this. It just looked like a bomb site.
I can't even
Rocks
imagine.
everywhere, tufts of grass. And I said, but the key thing was that the tree cover had been cut back, which is an enormous effort that involves blisters and danger, trees falling on your head and kids dying and burning and constant struggle just to keep the tree canopy away. And then that's a field. And you look at it and go, wow, that's a field. And West Africa grows, they have a certain indigenous form of rice. It's nothing to do with like paddy rice, Asian rice, which is delicately laid out in beautiful paddy fields. This is hardcore stuff. It's a husky seed, throw it on the ground. If you're lucky, rains, sun, it grows. Really difficult to grow, really difficult to harvest, really difficult to thresh, really difficult to store. The moot word there is difficult. Life is difficult. It is just frigging difficult. And so I left there in awe of the spirit to survive. What was intriguing is how that consumes so much that you're left not able to thrive. You can't grow by any Western model. You can't develop by any Western model. And I put that as an important qualification, because it is only the Western model. Capitalistic growth, year on year, GDP growth, la 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 la.
This is such I think one of the most. That is one of the strongest impressions I got from the book, as well as Blood River, is just how difficult and hard and how much empathy you get for these societies that, of course, they haven't developed the same way that we have. That process you just described of trying to grow a crop that probably has barely marginal nutritional value, and it's so hard to do. It's kind of like getting on the first rung of the ladder. No wonder things are so much harder. And it's one of the great impressions from both of those books I got. From.
I'm glad you mentioned Blood River, because I just want to mention that this journey for me there was a purity about this journey, because I was sweating it, walking it. I was doing 6 hours a day, 8 hours a day. Greene was a good diarist. He was right. And he said this village here connects. It's 8 hours walk to this village, and it's 6 hours walk to this village, and then there's a river there with a crossing where you got to worry about. He's accurate. And Blood River, you might remember, I was the driver there was the constant attendant was fear. I was moving quickly. I wasn't able to dawdle. I wasn't able to stop in villages and spend days in places to pick up the mood music, because it was get out of here, white guy. Fires must be put out. Can't light a fire. Sort of thing. The Liberian exercise was ha ha ha. Actually, a bit more of that physical exercise. It was a lot of I lost a shed load of weight. But there was a purity about it, because you're actually walking with the rhythms of the day. You're picking up on the rhythms of the day of people in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Okay, so here's a cliche. I have seen all over Africa. I'll be driving from an airport and I'll see, there's some shadowy figures sleeping under, and they're actually sleeping under a tree in the middle of the day. You think, I'll put that in a box. Later in the day, people in a park. There's people sleeping on the park bench. Okay. And I guess my prejudice, my preconceived thing is, they've got a bit of time off. They're not occupied. They're just kind of dawdlers, right? They're idlers, to use a sort of old-fashioned term. Idlers, sleeping. Let me tell you what I worked out. In Liberia, the drill was this. Get up in the dark. Put your boots back on. Stinking, horrible boots. Socks. No food, nothing. If you're lucky, maybe some cold rice from the previous night. There's no refrigeration, there's no food, there's nothing. Get some of that in your belly. Go walk. Maybe a biscuit. Walk. The sun's now up. Sledgehammer starts to hit on your brain. Poof, poof, poof. By about 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, you can go no further. I would pull over, literally like a motorbike, but walking, pull over under a tree, settle down on the ground, and fall into the most extraordinary sleep, and be woken by the sense of 4 hours having passed. It's getting slightly cooler. The heat of the day was like a sledgehammer, like a steam hammer. And at 2 o'clock, I shake myself with my guys, Johnson, Mr. Amaru, who was accompanying us, and my passepartout, who we haven't mentioned, called David, who was my mate, who was walking with me. And we would start to walk again. And we walked till it cooled. We walked as the afternoon cooled until it got dark. And now I never patronize anyone in my mind's eye when I see them sleeping, because I know they got up at 1:30 early and they walked a frig of a long way, and they carried something heavy, and whatever, and they've worked, they've done this, and they're going to be doing something towards the end of the day. So I've changed my terrible prejudice about that, because you learn the rhythms of the day. No one ate food in the middle of the day, because you only light the fire once, you light it at the end of the day, and that's that. We ate chicken, rice, maybe some cassava leaves. But what was interesting is it was never salted. I had no idea how valuable salt is. Now I understand why people would walk across the Algerian Saharan desert for salt.
Why? What did you experience?
What it's like.
Flavor or the cramping?
I can't tell you how difficult it is to swallow food which has got no salt in it when you are salt deprived already. It's like just putting matter into your mouth, and you've got to swallow it, and you've got to get carbohydrates into your stomach, because you've got a big shed load of physical work to do tomorrow morning. And if you do, you'll run out, you'll plonk, you won't have any energy. But if there's no salt, it's like gravel. It's just extraordinary. And I just struggled down with slosh water down to wash it down, to try and ease it on its way. And dream of having some flavouring. I got to one place where we found some sort of seasoning packets, old nori things, K&O, they're kind of. I bought a shed load of them because it just transformed a meal and made it palatable. It wasn't tasty. It was just I could physically swallow it. Again, that teaches me. I mean, how. So people are obsessed with weight, right? In the West, everyone goes to the gym and you want to be ripped and ripped and ripped. In Liberia and Sierra Leone, I saw physical specimens of a quality that were higher than anything I've ever seen. And I thought about it, because you have a lot of time when you're walking for 38 days, and you've got no processed food going into your system at all. You've got nothing unhealthy. The only thing that goes in is incredibly simple. It's palm oil, cooked chicken, and boiled rice, and cassava leaves. Maybe some fish if you're near a stream. And whatever your day is, it's going to involve a lot of frigging physical work in 35-degree heat and 85% humidity. It's like doing all your work in a sauna. And I just thought, wow, why do people go to gyms? You should just, this is where the most, the finest human specimens are naturally, because this is the diet. It actually really did scare me off processed food, because you think, my God, what is it that goes into processed food to keep it alive on the shelf? I was for 38 days. You're in a place where there's no electricity, so there's no food storage. So you eat it immediately. You cook a chicken. It won't be there in the morning. The chicken will have gone off in the morning. It's just not healthy. It's just not cool. I did see some smoked animal, and I say animal as in fruit bats and all sorts, rats, cane rats, and smoking is a preservative. And I say smoking, I mean charring. I saw it. I didn't taste it. It didn't fill me with love. And I did the trip in 2009. 5 years later, 2014, Ebola, pretty much where I walked, right on the border between Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia, right in the hinterland. And it's brought there because someone ate fruit bats, infected fruit bats. And we can riff on Ebola if you want to briefly, but Ebola comes from a place in the Congo, and it hadn't been seen outside the Congo Basin. The Congo Basin is a big piece of real estate. Faithful listeners will remember that from Blood River, huge. But Liberia is nowhere near the Congo River Basin. In fact, it's 2,400 kilometers from the foundational place where Ebola was first found. A village called Yambuku in northern DRC, Northern Democratic Republic of Congo. And scientists were amazed how the hell it made that jump, because Ebola had manifested itself, but only ever in the Congo River Basin. That kind of made sort of biological sense. So how the hell did it get 2,400 clicks away? in this little village called Mamiadu, which is on the village, as I said, right on the three-cornered border crossing between Guinea-Conakry, Liberia and Sierra Leone, and it was fruit bats. Fruit bats carried it there, and people remember the death count. One child dies, and 14,000 others would die before it died out, that Ebola outbreak in 2014. So it's a tough environment, and the achievement, the human achievement of survival is so colossal. I left that trip with a different appraisal of what it is to succeed. You don't need Gothic cathedrals or universities or proven academic bodies or even philosophical schools of thought, all of which are the yardsticks of Western development, right? Great cities, great places, great nations, national myths. Actually, all of that is not as important as just surviving. And I found that was a big, big lesson for me. So those tiny remote villages, which are today, as we speak, pretty much untouched from when I was there in 2009, and the really spooky thing, pretty much unchanged from when Graham Greene passed through in 1935, untouched. You mentioned a nice thing. You mentioned something earlier on. You pointed out that I passed through a village where Graham Greene had come across a German doctor.
Before you do that, though, I just want to interject that on that exact point of the villages remaining unchanged since Graham Greene came through, obviously in Blood River, you saw the exact opposite. They were even worse than the journalists whose footsteps you were following in. But this is a line from the book that I just wanted to point out because I thought it was really, really beautiful. Is that it wasn't the echoes of splendor Graham Greene described. You just saw decay.
Yeah, he did riff a little bit about the kind of the beauty, the great lifting the green veil of going into the rainforest and finding all of these statuesque trees, and he got quite passionate about that. I saw perhaps I detected something slightly different. Where were we? Forgive me.
You were going to talk about Junger, or the Nazi doctor, one of the.
Oh well, remember, yeah. So I guess the point of the story, the point of this is that the outside world laps like water on an island, occasionally reaching into Liberia. Occasionally that a lap will reach in. The question is, what influence does it have? And Graham Greene, 1935, his lapping water was only framed in one way, right? There's a really big thing happening in the world in 1935. He was doing that League of Nations thing I referred to, but at a higher level, there was a man called Adolf Hitler had become Chancellor of Germany, and he was taking the world down a wormhole of moral decay. Graham Greene came from a family of overachieving siblings. They were pretty much all of them were amazing. And his younger brother was a journalist, weirdly for the Daily Telegraph, my old newspaper, in Berlin in the early 30s. How cool would that have been to actually have been in the belly of the beast? There's that famous the rise and fall of the Third Reich. Is it Morris, American journalist who was there? Pretty sure it was Morris. It's just extraordinary to watch Germany go bananas. Greene had been to visit his brother just before he went to Liberia, and guess what? The brother had been to Dachau. Greene writes in his book about Dachau. Then was not a concentration camp like a death camp. It was the earliest form of concentration camp, which is where you concentrated all your trouble. So the Germans then, under Hitler, took all the lefties and the communists and the deviants, people who went into it wasn't a Jewish persecution complex. It was a concentration place for all of your troublemakers. It was cruel and brutal, but they weren't killing them. It was a labor camp. But Greene refers to Dachau, and I got in touch with the what's it called? The Holocaust Museum in Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. I know a researcher. And said, can anyone find any reference to Dachau or concentration camps in print before Graham Greene refers to it in his book from 1936? And I still haven't found a single one. So Greene, again, talk about prescient. He was ahead of it because he smelt. He knew that Dachau wasn't what it was being presented as, which was just a prison. It was actually the beginning, the thin end of a vile wedge. He didn't know where that wedge would come from. Anyway, the point about the story is that Germany moves up. The water laps in. Graham Greene goes through this village, and we are in the middle of nowhere in Liberia, and he finds a white doctor. Because guess what? There's a mission station there, classic model, and that white doctor is German. And Graham Greene goes into this German doctor's house, and on the wall, Adolf Hitler. And now, of course, from this context, you think, oh, he's obviously a crazy Nazi. No, he wasn't. He was a proud German. He was a German nationalist, right? He was the Chancellor. He might have been a Nazi, this doctor. He might have been a kind of headbang extremist. But also, it's his head of state. You know, he's a proud German. He's off representing Germany, you know, in deepest, darkest Africa. You know, it's a bit like having a picture of the Queen on the wall if you're a nutty monarchist. Or the King, forgive me. I should get up to date. And that was why Greene was so cool, because he would spot these things. He would spot that was important. That Hitler, he could smell something was coming down the thing. Anyway, so Junge, Dr. Bush, perfectly civilized man, a very interesting guy. Greene doesn't name him in the book, but he does name him in his diaries. I then did a bit of research, one thing led to another. I ended up getting in touch with Junge's daughter, who's in her 80s, living in Rostock in northern Germany. And her father, get this, drowns in the Bismarck. He was then, having been a doctor in the bush in Liberia, would become a German naval doctor and serve in the German Navy. And he was on that big battleship, the Bismarck, and drowns there. That's a very Greenian sort of character. Can you believe? Anyway, why am I riffing on this? Because the point that Greene was making was that the outside world might lap up, but when the water recedes, what's left? Does it change? Rural Liberia? And I was going there, and I'd seen other water had lapped up. You know, a Swedish iron ore operation had operated in, generated a bunch of money and a bunch of development and a railway in rural Liberia. That had brought in a certain influence. Water had lapped up. And then the tide had receded again. What was left? A broken railway, decay. You know, any sort of Western model, the things that survived were
hope lost.
Were those bush villages. Yeah, and all that promise and, you know, money this and money the other had not materialized permanently, but the same villages, the same devil worship. Devil worship not in terms of I'm worshipping a nasty figure. Devil worship, I respect an animist communicator. And this is why it was so illuminating. And it gave me a sense of trying to understand better where a society could be hijacked by the Charles Taylors of this world, if we segue back to that earlier part of this conversation. That's why it was so enriching. It was a great privilege to go on that trip, to be able to cross the border, plural. I crossed Sierra Leone, Liberia into Guinea, Guinea back into Liberia, which sounds, why is he making a fuss about crossing borders? Because we're in an area where there are no border crossings. You're literally crossing bridges, you're crossing rivers on canoes. I mean, that really was, you know, straight out of the 19th century. And the greatest privilege was meeting Johnson and Mr. Omaro, who were extraordinary guides. I would have made the point, I'm sure, in our Blood River Riff about how outsiders come to these parts of the world, and if you come there with pretending to know everything, you're doomed. You're screwed. You have to have the humility that you need gatekeepers. You need guys to open the gate for you. And Johnson was my gatekeeper. He opened the gate. I hired him as a friend from a friend of a friend of a friend. I needed a guide who could guide us from this border crossing from Sierra Leone, a place called Kailahun. We were going to go to a place called Mosambolahun. And you could just about find them on the map, but I would, you know, who can help me find the route from Kailahun to Mosam? And I hear that there's a guy called Johnson who's done this, been a refugee after being forced out of his village, open brackets, where he had saw the fire, but I hadn't heard that story yet, close brackets. He had then spent like 10 years taking refugees back to their rural villages in this part of the world. So he knew every footpath and every village because he'd returned. He was an ICRC employee for the International Community of Red Cross, you know, refugees. And I met him, and you know, we shook hands on a day rate, and he was going to work for 2 days or 3 days because he knew his area. He didn't know the area beyond, and he was a cool man. He said, "This is my area, and I'll work with you for 3 days." We went off. He was an astonishing man. He is an astonishing man, and we did this journey together. And by the time we're now way over in that area, I described him being so upset. he himself is out of his comfort zone, which is why it makes it so illuminating. That it's I want to get away from the kind of the white savior, outsider comes in, it's his perspective. Johnson's perspective, himself leaving his area within Liberia and going to an area where he wasn't comfortable, where the language is different, the food cultures are different, the devil's different, literally the devil. How are our ancestors communicated with there? That was so exciting to watch. And Johnson was he was an extraordinary man, and he helped me better understand.
And I think a moment that really stood out to me from the book as well is when you part ways with him after him spending pretty much the whole journey with you. Whatever, by our standards, insignificant amount of money that you did pay him was enough for him to build his own house. And
he went home.
What an incredible
Brian,
detail.
He went home. Right, he had $1,600 in his pocket, and he bought a house. And he didn't even go home. He went to the capital city to buy the bits he needed for the house. So all the tin sheeting he needed for the roof, all the nails, the tools, the fittings, and he went home to his long-suffering wife and a couple of kids. Sadly, he's lost his wife. Lost her to a heart attack, sadly, about 5 years ago. So he's bringing up the boys alone now and doing a good job, but he's alone. And literally went home with a flat pack house. He left his wife with this crazy story that there's some European guy going to meet him at a border, some story about walking on, God knows, maybe he'll be back at the weekend, maybe a little longer, whatever. He turns up a month and a half later, almost a month and a half later, in a minibus down a dirt road with a flat pack house, and he built that home. It was transformative. But the other story, we did a journey together, and there's a purity to journeying, travel, if you don't know where you're going to end up. And our expectations now, we have Instagram that tells us if you go to Lake Monica, you've got to go and take a photograph of that tree. If you go to Myanmar, you've got to take a photograph of that pagoda. If you've got to go to Spain, you've got to run with the bulls. You kind of know what you're doing. And yet, traditional travel, old travel, real travel, what I would call, Graham Greene
Journey
travel, looking
without
across
maps.
the horizon, you don't know where you're going to go, right? Exactly. You don't know what's going to be beyond the horizon, and that's what was super special about this. I didn't know if I was going to be able to cross the borders. It didn't. It's not. People were saying, no, you'll never get across. There's no border crossing. How will you cross that? How will you get? Immigration, passports, bullshit. And I, a bit like Blood River, I learned the borders there were so brilliantly remote. I crossed, and by the time you get to the next village, border issues, they're not nearly as important as, do you have any food? Not nearly as, do you have any, you got some salt? Oh, we've heard that village has got some seasoning. Wow, I'll give you my right leg for that seasoning. And suddenly borders, and going back to our beginning of this conversation, Pheasant Island. We give up an island for 6 months a year. Borders become what they are. Bloody unimportant. I mean, really trivial. It's just who you are, how you're living, how you're surviving. It's quite a nice double back segue, actually, looping back.
Well, maybe we'll get another opportunity to full circle a few other points as well with this. But the reason that moment stood out to me quite a lot is because, this Johnson fella, clearly incredibly resilient, lots of endurance, a lot of sort of social awareness. I mean, he guided you through a lot of unknowns. And in most Western contexts, he'd probably be a pretty well-off, respected member of whatever community he was a part of. Yet,
Agreed.
The sort of peak of his potential in Liberia was getting enough $1,600 to buy raw ingredients for a house, put them on top of his head, and then walk back to his village and build it. And so throughout, obviously, this book, but as well Blood River, there's just example after example of this. And I wonder how it's affected your thinking of the geographical determinism argument, which is simply that, the economic development of a country is largely due to its geographical, what it's birthed with geographically, and less so to do with the culture. So I just want to ask you what you think about that.
I guess that brings us back to the other Tim's point that geography is everything. I I recognize the importance of geography, and of course, but the way I phrase it is geography is one thread, an important thread in any nation's construction, in any state building, in any community. It's really important. You might call it the golden thread, even, if you're going to push it. But we live on a carpet of many threads, all drawn together. And it might be geography, it might be meteorology, what your weather system is like, your geology might be as important if you're going to go down this route. But it's also about the humans. It's also about the environment that they're in. Here's one, glaring, extraordinary, scientific, human, biological consideration. Europeans leave Europe. They find Africa, as in the African continent, the potential African continent, a long time before they find North America. But which do they develop? They develop North America. Why is that? I mean, okay, you can come up with scientific article, you can come up with a whole bunch of analysis. Let me give you one straightforward fact, which is that Europeans arriving on the east coast of America do not die from disease like as much as they did from arriving in Africa. It's just frigging biology. So geography is one thing if the soils are rich, but if they also bear an insect that kills you, then that's a factor. So human society is a woven tapestry. Geography is a thread, but so is biology, so is anthropology, so is philosophy, so is the willingness to get on with your neighbours, so is farsightedness, so is, there was this, I believe there was a Polynesian community of fiercely rival islands who used to fight a lot, and they worked out that if they fought and they killed each other, it was just a massive pain in the arse, right? So because all the men died, and all the muscle died, all the crop gathering, hunting muscle died. So they worked out a system which is so far-sighted, which is we'll have one single fighter fights another, and that settles the whole thing. And then you think, hold on, isn't that the story of David and Goliath? To save the two armies slaughtering each other, you have two representatives of the army. So that shows a certain vision. And all the geography in the world is not going to make any difference if two armies slaughter each other in a battlefield. So geographical determinism. I hate the word determinism because it takes human influence and ingenuity out of the equation, and I've never been a believer. It's a crucial factor. Of course it is. But, for example, Kiev had ownership of the greatest soils and fields of Europe. The richness of the humus soil in north of the Black Sea is so rich that the Greeks mythologized about it and called it the Elysian Fields. They were the Champs-Élysées. That's where they came from, right? I mean, that's where the Elysian Fields were. That's where the Athenians got their richest crops from this area where they sailed their ships to the north of the Black Sea, the Elysian Fields. So that's a really important geographical feature. So Moscow might have aspirations towards that geographical feature, but it only becomes relevant when the Kievan Rus do not get on with the Mongols who invade them, but the founding fathers of Moscow are quislings. They compromise. They actually give in to the Mongols. They don't fight the Mongols. They give them tax. They pay tax. So, and then the geographical feature of having a rich soil source for your food to maintain a large growing population becomes relevant. But until that human behavior of becoming a quisling, are you a collaborator or are you not a collaborator, then that is irrelevant in the terms of that particular frontier. So I do waffle on a bit, having riffed about clarity and brevity. I would ask people to think about life, human existence as a rich tapestry, and each element is literally like elegant knots on a carpet, on a Persian carpet. They reinforce each other. They plait. In the plaiting, they make themselves stronger. One and one adds up to more than one. And in the case of existence in the bush of Liberia, the hinterland, the upline up country in Liberia, that tapestry is as complicated and rich as the agora in ancient Greece, where philosophy is being discussed, or the capitalist paradigm of New York City in the 1920s, when Wall Street is unleashed. It is just as complicated. It's different elements coming together, and they have different answers that you and I might not understand, but a journey like mine was such a thrill because I got to understand, I sensed a bit better some of these different threads and how they interlock.
But it is inescapable. Maybe that's too hyperbolic. But the reason I asked that question is to try and emphasize how much empathy and significance there is on some of the building blocks of economic development. The fact that they had to burn away thick canopy covered rainforest just to be able to throw some husk seeds on the floor to maybe get this marginal crop to grow, and that it's so unbelievably humid and hot and drought and ridden that you can't necessarily lay cement, therefore you don't have a road to transport to bring down the costs of things. The USA has this fantastic internal river system where you can transport it just a fraction of the cost of anywhere else, which drives all types of economic development in other places, third, fourth order consequences that we can't even, map onto. Basically, in both of the stories, just that difficulty is so, for me at least, it's so emphasized, and it gives so much more explanation. So while it is a rich tapestry, it's like the thread, which is your geography. Not everyone's starting on the same starting line.
I get that, yeah, and I've used that exact wording before myself, but I wonder if you could think about it in this way, that you're saying the rich tapestry, implying that richness by some sort of Western economic capitalist development model is the yardstick for success. I'm saying just to survive in that environment is a rich tapestry. I mean, you talk about the Mississippi system, 5,000 kilometers of navigable river, quite rightly. It's amazing. It's an extraordinary asset. But the amazing thing about the Mississippi network is that the people who arrived there, not the locals who were already there, the people who arrived there, bought their own ability to be able to exploit it. The Congo river system isn't quite 5,000 kilometers of navigable, but it's of the order of 2,000 or 3,000. It is an extraordinary natural asset, and yet the people there didn't have the willingness, the aptitude. They saw enough in what they had already developed, rather than the import-export model that might have driven third and fourth order development in the way that you're describing. I guess my phrasing is that the message I took from both these journeys was that survival is such a colossal achievement that is all the richness that you're ever going to get. And our model, our presumption that it's got to then grow and have cemented roads and all the rest of it, might not. And I went there genuinely thinking that, and I changed my mind, because I just saw how the majesty of existing is so colossal, it's so bright, so magnificent, that is enough, that reflects the greatest human endeavour. So the Johnsons of this world, he is surviving without his wife, the two lads. He's got his house, the one we've referred to. He tells me we're in good communications. He's a great communicator. I've been back once, and he bought me a lovely shirt from his woven cotton shirt from his village, which I wear on high days and holidays, even though it does make me look like a bloody, ethno-idiot. Because some people can carry off these shirts and some people can't. But anyway, such is life. And he talks about, this is another, I've got a hectare of palm I've been able to creating palm oil, and palm oil is money because I can palm oil and use palm oil for this and the other. And I guess before I did the trip, or before I understood the places a little better, I would have thought, well, that's great. Only half a hectare, though. I mean, that's not much growth. I mean, where's your money? When are you going to have a holiday in South France? When are you going to get on a flight and go to Australia and watch cricket? That's my yardsticks. And of course, him having a hectare is such a colossal achievement. It is so enormous that actually I should wind my bloody neck in with my presumptions and my projections. Geography, biology. I mentioned, Ebola. That was a biological freak. It had never been seen before, this fruit bat infected with Ebola arriving in that part of the world. So these are factors, and I guess just taught me, these trips did teach me just to try and control, in my mind, for my own preconceptions of what success is, and then allow people to tell me how they use their human endeavour. And societies have been there for a lot longer than, let's remember, African societies, or maybe not Bantu African societies, but certain indigenous communities, pre-Bantu Africans, a lot longer than European. I mean, they were all rooted from Africa. So the achievement, perhaps the greatest African achievement, is the twin helix of DNA, evolved humanity. That is the greatest achievement. And whether or not they have that particular string of DNA generates smartphones and penthouse apartments in West London is largely irrelevant. It is trivial in comparison to human frigging DNA. You've solved the problem of lactose tolerance or whatever. Wow. And I guess in a way, I got a sense of that on those journeys. But discursive.
I'm conscious of the time. I think we've really covered at least everything I wanted to cover. There's little, side alleys like Lassa fever and some of the leprosy, and more on the sort of black magic and the devil worship.
Well, have me back on next week. We can do another 2 hours. I love conversations with Ryan because you're such an engaged reader, and you've read the books so closely, but you also make those connections and you see the interconnectedness with other things. It's a delight. I just feel for you because you've got a shed load of editing to do now. Have to play this back.
No worries at all, mate.
Polish this particular sow's ear.
I appreciate you saying, but if I could still bend your ear for a few more questions.
Yeah, sure.
One of the impossible to ignore stories of Africa is just all of the kleptocracy that takes place in all these different countries. You gave this fantastic example that I've used again and again last time on Blood River with the Congo River, how it has this bountiful hydro potential, just impossibly bountiful hydro potential, yet again and again, European company, Australian company, engineers come in and they just can't get it to work. And it's just, again, a case of kleptocracy. Liberia and Sierra Leone, you touched upon the rubber trade there, and then as well, of course, the De Beers and the diamond trade there. So if you could educate the audience a little bit about the history of rubber and the history of diamonds in those two countries.
Yeah, I will. But just before I do that, did we have a conversation? Did we refer to Andrew Forrest, Australia's wealthiest man, Twiggy Forrest, the last time we spoke?
Yes. Neither of us could remember his name, but it was, yes.
There. And he was the guy. So just forgive me. The Congo. He is the guy who is an Australian. He signed a memorandum of understanding. Now it's been 2 years since you and I had this conversation about the potential, hydroelectric potential of the lower Congo River, and this guy thinking, wow, if I could harness that river's power, then I could create green hydrogen. That was his dream. I have to say, nothing has happened in 2 years since that. So this is the absolute. This is a guy he's a mover and a maker with his own private jet. He's literally out of succession. He's a squillionaire. I have followed with interest. He's not been able to make any progress on getting that thing delivered. Okay, so by any Western standards, how would you develop? What riches might there be in this part of the world we're talking about? Sierra Leone has a known diamond presence, and I say that because finding diamonds and finding where they come from are two separate things. You often find diamonds in riverbeds because they've been washed down by Mother Nature, basically panning it. And so you find them in the gravels. but you don't know where the diamonds came from. Now, the diamonds all come from one place, which is underneath the surface of the Earth, and they get erupted up a squillion years ago in magma, volcanic magma, special type of magma, bearing these diamonds. The magma has a name now. It comes from the South African town of Kimberley. It's known as a kimberlite. Kimberley in South Africa is the place where the first one was found. It's basically like the root of a tooth coming up. You can imagine from your jawline, root of the tooth, and the crown of your tooth is the Earth's surface, and up that root came and was solidified in hard rock, these diamonds. And if you can find the kimberlite, if you can find that tooth and dig down, you're in the money. That's where you're going to find riches. So Sierra Leone, they found river diamonds, so they've been washed off the top of the tooth and down the rivers. And that's okay. I mean, there's money to be made, but it is hard work. It's scrabbling through. It's a sort of work which is beguilingly easy. You could go with a shovel and a pan and go to the riverbed, to the bottom of a river, to riverbank, and panhandle through river gravels and actually find rough diamonds. And yes, that happened 60, 70 years ago. But the question was, did they ever find any kimberlites? Because that's where the real money is to be found. And De Beers spent a lot of time looking for kimberlites, and it took them forever. They never really made any progress. They just kept on doing what you might call artisanal mining, so low-level mining. So the diamonds were small and blah. Graham Greene comes into it because in the 1940s, when he's working in Sierra Leone as a spy, he's working for MI6, he's actually doing a lot of anti-diamond smuggling because this. So Graham Greene refers to a long-established illegal diamond industry in the 1940s, smuggling, basically. Can you imagine how difficult it would be to stop people smuggling things the size of your fingernail? I mean, very small. So it's basically piecemeal and small level stuff. But the problem is, if you're a rebel in the 1990s and you got a bunch of drugged up kids with Kalashnikovs, how else are you going to motivate them? Hey, take that village and you'll become a diamond millionaire. It's a cheap thing to do, easy. So there's a lot of fighting in the diamond areas. That was really what drove a lot of the fighting in the Sierra Leonean War, which was caused by rebels coming across from Liberia to go look for diamonds. But it's not mines, it's not equipment, it's not heavy plant. It's guys with shovels. It's really backbreaking, simple, easily to, everyone gets abused in the whole system. Horrific. So that's the history in Sierra Leone. No diamonds in Liberia, none. Just the way that geography works. You talk about geography, I might refer to geology. There are no geological kimberlites. They have found a few kimberlites, some of these teeth upstream in eastern Congo now. Wrong, in eastern Sierra Leone, but they haven't found any particularly rich ones. But there are no kimberlites in so that one, the thread of the tapestry, there's none in Liberia. Anyway, but rubber. So Henry Ford invents the mass-produced motor car. What does he need? He needs an infinite supply of pneumatic tires. Mr. Dunlop invents vulcanization, which is a process where you take natural rubber and you make it a lot harder by adding something to it. I think sulfur, but scientists in your audience will know more than me. And that hardens it, that vulcanizes rubber and makes it tough enough for you to drive a car on. And guess what? Natural rubber grows in our old friend the Congo from Blood River. It grows there. It's naturally an ivy called hevea, a type of ivy. But that rubber isn't quite as good for farming purposes as a rubber which is found indigenously in Brazil. So about this time, all of this is to come together, and literally, it's like bankers, like venture capitalists, like equity fund managers today. Hey, shit! How do we make a shitload of money? I know, cars need rubber. Rubber doesn't grow anywhere very well. But hold on. Isn't that country called Liberia really good for the right weather conditions? I know. We'll go there and we will set up the world's biggest rubber plantation, and we will sign a contract. Now, this is back in the time when that country was run by these rather horrible politicians who were all either freed slaves or sons of freed slaves. And they cut a deal. And they cut a deal like this, and it said you can have something like 1 million acres for 99 years as a lease. And they signed it with the great company, a name that many people will recognize, Firestone, the American tire company Firestone from Akron, Ohio. And they signed the deal. Now, 99 years rings a bell with me because it's exactly the same time period that Britain signed a land deal with China for Hong Kong. So when Hong Kong was handed back in 1997, that was the end of a 99-year lease. Very similar, commercial thing. But guess what? Singapore, so Hong Kong and rural Liberia. Do you picture them in the same breath? No. So they signed the 99-year lease. They unleashed an economic whirlwind on the area. They said, look, we're going to have all this money's coming in, all these jobs, and it was pretty tough. There was slaving. This was one of the periods, the 1920s. This is part of the issue. Were the workers working in the Firestone plantation? Were they actually held at gunpoint? And the terrible truth was, they were. Chiefs were being coerced to give up their workforce, their young men, to go and work in the Firestone plantation. You can fly over Firestone today and you see serried ranks of mature, heavier trees. They're a funny tree. They need a certain behavior. You need to cut them and shape them and tap them in a certain way. It's hard work. It is not an easy process. So it promised riches, didn't deliver them. A little bit like the Congo. So those are your, I guess, what's the commonality between the two? Diamonds in Sierra Leone and rubber. They both promise an easy buck. They turn out to be harder to produce, an easier buck, physically harder. I mean, it's really tough work. Then there isn't anything easy about the buck. It's a hard work buck. And it's in that hardness that things go wrong. That people aren't prepared to do the work because they're either being coerced to do it and forced to do it, or if they are being paid, they're being paid peanuts. And people get stressed about that. And the economic model, that driver, isn't sophisticated enough to come up with an alternative. So they both dry up. So both industries exist now, but they're a fraction of what they were.
And much like much of the other kleptocracy, like the iron ore mines in Guinea, the tropical timber all throughout the Congo, the cobalt even, because these are resources whose sole purpose is for export, all of the infrastructure that is built around them does not at all complement the locals or any other types of rhythms of the economy. And so it's super narrow, and it goes through, has to come from top down through the state. So a couple palms get very, very greased and the rest are sort of just left.
You're absolutely right. And the memory I had from the Congo was that if you do a mine in the Congo, you have to take in everything. It's not like you just take in the sophisticated mining equipment. You got to take it. I remember you have to take in the umbrellas for when it rains in the rainy season, because you can't buy a local umbrella. And you build a fence around your compound, and within your compound you have your own little piece of, Australia, because if it's an Australian mining company, Canada, if it's Canadian, America, but beyond it, it's there be dragons. And it's that kind of self-sufficiency, that kind of weird capsulization. There is no economic multiplier because the money doesn't leak out beyond the fence because it all goes out to the foreign power. It doesn't. The whole point about the exercise is you don't leak it out through the fence because it's corrupt and blah 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 blah. So it's exactly the wrong economic process. It doesn't have any Keynesian multiplier, and you describe it exactly correctly. In Liberia, an iron ore operation, which I come across towards the end of the trip, because it navigates. It gives me because they found a huge mountain full of iron ore in the 1960s. But in order to get the iron ore out, they had to build a dead straight railway, which they did through the jungle. Dead straight, bam, and it was an American-Swedish operation called Lamco, and it went Echo. And you can actually Google, and there are YouTube videos of kids playing in swimming pools a place called Yekapa, and the Lamco, compound. Kids had this idyllic life, sunny, warm, easy, cheap childcare. Dad was earning money there, mother was doing whatever she was doing here, and going on that railway. You could actually see on YouTube like Lamco home held videos from the 1960s, and then of course that railway goes to hell in a handbasket in the war period, and the whole thing collapses. But I find the railway being refurbished when I'm there in 2009 by a company, a name that people will have heard, Mittal, who were the big Indian steel company. And just like Henry Ford said, give me rubber, where does it come from? It's going to come from Liberia. Mittal, give me steel, I need iron ore. Where does iron ore come from? Anywhere. I don't give a damn where it comes from. As long as you just ship it to me, I'll make steel out of it. they invested in refurbishing this plant because the hill remains full of iron ore and the physical geography is the same. You've got to cover 200 clicks of jungle with the railway. And one of the most sublime moments was following the line of this old railway, thinking it was defunct, thinking the railway had gone, thinking, I didn't appreciate how much work was going into its refurbishment. And we're following through the jungle, because in the Congo you came across railway tracks which were literally broken and knackered and unused. And this really weird thing came around the corner in Liberia on the railway. It was a Toyota Hilux mounted on the railway tracks. You can actually buy a sort of bogie thing that you put a vehicle on a bogie, which the bogie has metal wheels that run on the railway tracks, and somehow you gear them to you put a rubber strap around the wheels of the vehicle, and as you press the accelerator on your car, anyway. Bottom line, obviously you don't need to steer because you're only going along the line of the tracks. So this Hilux comes towards me like some sort of spaceship. I go, what the fuck's going on here? Anyway, they stopped and they talked. Of course, they had air conditioning and they had water. Have some water. They buzzed the window down, and me and my friend David Johnson, we were sweating cobs, and maybe we had our morning sleep or we hadn't had our morning sleep. We were absolutely knackered. I remember being very but sore at this point because I'd had a bit of a problem. Anyway, goes the window and this air-conditioned air wafts out, and there's some European dude in there. He said, "Hey, you want some water?" I went, "Yeah, sure, we'll take it." But that was a bit of a sort of spaceship moment. But this is the kicker. And then we finally get to the end and I knew that Mittal were there because I'd had some friend who put me in touch with the head of security at the port, because the railway ends in a port. So we arrive at the port. End of the journey, 38 days, fabulous trip, loved it, loved the walk, loved the physical nature of it. But that meeting, finding the sea, the end point was reaching the sea. For Graham Greene, he reached the sea and took a boat. I was going to find a boat there as well. Reaching the sea was a really emotional moment. I mean, it really was tears in the eyes, because your feet are pretty sore at this point. You've lost those kilograms. You're still, and you smell the sea before you see it, and then in comes it. And then we're actually in the compound of this iron ore operation, Mittal. And the security guy says, "Yeah, you can spend the night," and this is great, so we're going to be in a nice bed. And they have a canteen. They had a place where food was prepared. So I went in and I just eyes on stalks, and they had this a European working crew of 100 people, so they've got a chef constantly generating food. And I remember eating my eyes were bigger than my stomach, so I ate this pudding, this creme caramel, and I just got eaten too much. I had this creme caramel, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I walked out of this thing, and 30 yards later, just threw it up because my little body couldn't, having had no salt for this period that I've just described, to overdose on seasoning and salt and all this shit, and to have a creme caramel on top. And it was a memorable moment, but that was a capsule, and that was and the final kicker, Mittal refurbished that plant. Everything was on fine. $multi-hundred million effort, huge effort to Toyota Hiluxes on bogies, specialised there, chefs, 100 crew. They've mothballed it again. The Chinese demand for steel collapsed, and with that, the economics just went out the window. Goodbye, Daddy-O. They pulled the plug. So. The train track ain't used. The more
I learn about these massive resource extraction projects, I don't know, the kind of more empathy I get for these financiers and engineering companies as well on the other side, because you realize is that everyone is operating on very, very, very thin margins, and like you just identified, China says, actually, we just need, fractionally less ore than we needed before. The entire economics of that mine falls apart. And you realize that it's not as simple just to say the big evil colonial company coming in and taking the precious resources out of a country. It is way more complicated than that. So I get a bit of appreciation, and I guess a bit of sympathy as well for this company.
The other thing I took away from it was that point is absolutely right. But you can't see anything if you're on a capitalist model. The only goggles you need to wear are: does this make economic sense? And it only makes sense if steel is above this $100s per ton, and if it dips below, good night. It economic, we pull the plug. But the other thing I took, and this was a lesson about how the disconnect between the people of Liberia and their government, is how the government will not acknowledge what type of country Liberia is. It wants to falsify the image. It gives the illusion of being a modern, developed, capitalist, developed. It's we are going to do all these wonderful things. Well, you can only do all these wonderful things if you can afford it, right? Building schools, clinics, roads, facilities, infrastructure. And if you can't, it's a falsehood. And this is really one of the nastier elements of but the Congo trip and the Liberia trip, is that the governments project a totally illusory image. They're just bullshit. They lie about what they are providing. So when it came to that operation, refurbishing thing, this company was bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars in tax take to the central government. So that's hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a lot of money to be grafted by those greasy palms, as you described, the politicians. They were serious. I mean, the investment, the actual corporate investment, infrastructure, bogies, Toyota Hiluxes on wheels, water, fridges to keep the water cold, so I got a cold bottle, all of that were really, really expensive. But the government still wanted more. They said, well, you got to provide schools, along the route. Why haven't you provided clinics? And this is where the capitalist model gets slightly distorted in these, if you drop it into a place like the Congo or Liberia, Sierra Leone. Because your normal costings are, I'm going to run it commercially and I'm going to run it as a railway or an iron operation. But when you suddenly say, CSR, corporate social responsibility, you can't just employ people. You've got to look after their wives and their kids and their grandparents, and you've got to build roads and you've got to build bridges to their villages. You've got to make sure that you've got to infrastructure, fuel stations, all of this. Suddenly, the costings make it totally uneconomic, because the government does the square root of nothing and expects Metal or De Beers or the Australian Mining Company of the Congo or whatever to provide everything. And that's why it's so difficult for the roots to be put down, for real economic growth to happen, because there's this greed at the heart, there's a laziness at the heart and a delusion at the heart of government. They're deluded because they know they can't provide, so they come up with a bullshit narrative and blame the Western capitalist company.
Final question, Tim. I ask this question to every guest. Last time your answer was Rwanda. I just want to ask you again, what is a country you're particularly bullish on?
Bullish on. I'm going to say this. Ukraine. We're out of Africa. There's no reason why we have to be limited to Africa. And obviously I'm slightly crazy because Ukraine is 25% of its land mass is occupied by foreign force and it's under extraordinary military pressure. But Ukraine as a nation has struggled in its modern history as an independent state at the end of the Soviet Union, during the Second World War, accusations of this and the other, various things. But what's happened in these last 15 months and an ongoing war has created a sense of national identity and transformative national identity in that country to an extent that is unimaginable. And so the war will end and Ukraine will win the war. When I say win, Putin will have gone, Russia will be out of most of eastern Donbass and probably the Crimea. A lot more people are going to die between now and then, not least Mr. Putin. I can't see him walking out of this alive, but I don't see him surviving. And by then, Ukraine, its whole orientation will be different. It'll be in NATO, it'll be approaching the European Union. And let us remember where Ukraine was 5 years ago. It was more corrupt and more violent than Russia. I know bankers who didn't do business in Ukraine because they were terrified of the corruption. And this man, Zelensky, has absolutely transformed he's taken this horrific period, this maelstrom that they're under at the moment, and he's harnessed it, as have other Ukrainians. And so I see a transformation for Ukraine on the anvil of war, something very strong is being wrought, would be my kind of crazy answer.
I love it. We haven't had a Ukraine yet, and I completely agree with the sentiment that should they get through this on the right side, their entire orientation will have changed, as will their reputation on the world stage. And I think it's 40 million people, as you mentioned before, the most fertile lands. Most of Europe's developers are Ukrainian. So, you know, they've got so many ticks. If you have a million people to talk to, but Professor Timothy Snyder from Yale is one of the best experts on Ukraine, and he does the history, but he also does the current, you know, where it currently is. Snyder, Snyder. You know, he literally goes and advises Zelensky. He's given an online lecture on the modern history of Ukraine. I cannot recommend it enough. I'll check it out.
He gave it to some students at Yale. And they were like, I don't know, 60 in the room. By the time he's finished lecturing, he's talking to 500,000 people, and I'm one of them. I devoured every word of it, and it took. You maybe get him on as a guest because he is a remarkable historian who does that ability that good historians do, which is not to lay out the whole list of dates and facts and treaties. He can tease out what is relevant. You know, when I was riffing earlier about Kiev fighting the Mongols and the Muscovite leadership collaborating with the Mongols, he's a world expert on that. You know, he will talk you through exactly what happened when and blah blah blah. And it's just I just find it interesting. So he's a great person to listen to. If you've got an idle few hours, listen to Snyder. And anyway, so I think it sounds a bit crazy with where Ukraine is now, but riffing back to where we were, Britain, First World War, Second World War, they're absolutely elemental parts of national identity. Australia, Anzac Cove in Gallipoli, you know, a foundational myth for a nation. The events of February 2021, no, I don't mean that, do I? February 2022, securing Kiev, fighting Snake Island, these are foundational myths for the nation of Ukraine going forward. And I see it strangely, perversely, as ultimately a positively transformative exercise in Ukraine.
Unreal, Tim.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yes, thank you so much, sir. Both Blood River and as well Chasing the Devil, phenomenal books. I love them. It captures all this sort of adventure, but then as well explanation of a country that I seek out. And I think you and I both obviously project a lot onto Graham Greene as well. What an extraordinary character. And I cannot wait. As you can see, it's starting to seep into your answers at the end there. This final book on nationalism. What is a nation? I cannot wait for that to be released as well. So, yes. Thank you, Tim. And let's go watch the cricket.
Okay, great pleasure. Thanks. Thank you very much. Let's go watch the cricket. Okay, cheers. Bye. Yeah. Apart from, I have to tell you that Khawaja is out. LBW Broad.
Okay.
30. That's what you really want to hear.
32, you say?
35 for 1. Khawaja out for 3. LBW Broad. So Warner has seen off Broad. Hasn't been got out by Broad yet. But Warner's hanging in there, and Labuschagne is 7. But anyway, 30. Khawaja out.
Nice.
Back in the house. Go tell your story walking, man.
Actually, you know, I was meaning to say this to you at the beginning when we started recording, but I've lined up some really exciting podcasts for when I go back to Australia next year. Usman, the guy you just spoke about, Khawaja.
Oh yeah.
Brad Hogg, Ricky Ponting, Shane Watson, potentially Brett Lee. I'm just because for some reason in Australia there just aren't Australians doing many podcasts, which means this golden generation of cricketers who are all media hungry and want their egos to be flattered. For some reason have looked at my previous guests and seen, oh, Tim Butcher, Tim Marshall, journalists and geopolitical guys. I wonder, yeah, sure, but they'll take the life story of a cricketer, will fit in there nicely. But anyway,
oh well, I shall listen out for those.
I once trained with Usman, so we both played at the same club in it's called
Sydney.
Yeah, it's called Randwick Petersham, and.
Was he good?
Well, I mean, yeah, he was. Everyone knew was the prodigy when he was there. He was scoring all the runs for first grade. I was playing in the reserve, the under 18 sort of representative of that club, and so they would try and mix us with the first graders to make us feel sort of special, or whatever. But Usman, anyway. There's no point to that story. I guess it's just me fucking showing off.
No, it's terrific. But briefly, as you and I obviously are into the cricket narrative, if we ever get to talk about the trigger, there's one of these typically sort of weird British guys who left Oxford in 1870, walked through Bosnia and wrote some diaries, and I make reference to them. And the reason I make reference to them is that this dude. He goes to a Bosnian village and he describes a game of cricket. He said these guys are playing a game which would recognisably be cricket. It's a ball, it's bits of wood, it's the village against the village, whatever. And it was just so sweet that that there was a reference from 1870.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Anyway, I was having a conversation with someone. Who the hell was it? Anyway, he pointed out that Wisden made a reference to this guy's comments in the last. But one Wisden or whatever. Anyway, it just amused me. I find cricket. Obviously, we both find cricket not just as a sport, but also it's a great test. It is for me. It's the greatest test of character and concentration, determination, and all the rest of it. So, anyway, blah blah. Where were we? You one last question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Although I can't help myself, I want to add on to what you just said. It is. I had the sense before 2019. That the English cricket had become far less interesting. People didn't really care about it. The only thing they would ever tune in for was the Ashes. And anyway, you get 2019 and you get Ben Stokes doing it at Headingley, but then also at the World Cup final. And all of a sudden, now this Ashes series rolls around and it's the most compelling cricket that anyone can ever remember watching. And I wonder, in an alternative universe, Ben Stokes gets out for 5 in both of those innings. Where is English cricket right now? How much did the wind further be taken out of the sails? And cricket is just becomes a sport that private school boys play, and that's it. It's interesting.
No, you're so good. It's a very good point. All things. What's the word? These are variables that you can't control for, the what ifs. England, let me remind when was it? It was after Headingley that we went to the West Indies and were beaten 4-0, and we just looked like plum puddings. We looked like nothing. And then, Bazball comes along. And what was extraordinary was it's the same players. And in sport is extraordinary. Alex Ferguson, I hated Alex Ferguson because I'm a Leeds fan, but I have to begrudgingly say what an extraordinary example of a sporting wizard, because he could take dull metal and turn it into shining gold. And he famously took those kids, and as Alan Hansen said, you win nothing with kids, and they went on to win, everything. The FA Cup, the Premiership, and the Champions League, the Beckham generation. And it was that alchemy, that incredible skill. So McCullum has taken exactly the same players. He's just looked them in the eye and said, actually, the thing that's holding you back is between your ears. Your skill set is as high as Usman Khawaja's, and Khawaja's had a checkered career. He's a brilliant player, obviously, but he's had mental issues. And cricket really, ultimately, is about brain. It's about spirit. It's courage. It's character. It's dealing with pressure. And you can go through it in the kind of be a duff kind of guy and just I don't care and just carry on, or you can overthink it. And to see Joe Root blossom is so special because he's such a classy player, but when he was with the captaincy, it just weighed so heavy on him. And you could see how flat and dull it got. Anyway, it is a good what if. It is what I find amazing is that even in my wildest dreams, I couldn't have imagined Test cricket be embraced in the T20 100 bang blast generation as enthusiastically as it has been embraced. It just is. It's so exciting to watch people, audiences engaging with for 5 days, knowing that. Well, Shane Warne had a. There's a very nice interview between Atherton and Shane Warne. I might send it to you. You might be familiar with it, but he just makes some point about. He just says 5-day Test cricket. The best team wins. It's not an accidental piece of brilliance by a player. It's not an accident of weather. It's not an accident of pitch. 5 days is an exacting test. That's why it's so sublime. And he said that's why he enjoyed it so much, and why ultimately the best team wins. And when you've got two very, very good teams like these, it makes it utterly compelling, because we want to know ultimately. If England didn't give away 49 extras at the Edgbaston Test, different result. If they took catches, but then Australia, if Australia hadn't, blah blah, if they'd caught Stokes, if Smith hadn't dropped, and. Anyway, it's that's why sport's so wonderful. We can talk about it forever.
Agreed.
Anyway, let's go back to what we're talking about before we